Good evening, everybody. So I'm going to talk about sleep, my favorite topic. Let me just kind of open it up as we go. If you want to jump in and ask some questions, feel free to do so. There is a 30-minute Q&A at the end, so if you want to hold them till then, that's all good too. So just a disclaimer, I'm going to say sleep about 1,000 times. It might put some of you to sleep. And that's okay, because we're all for sleep, or at least we are in my field. Okay, so I'm going to cover a few different areas. Some of it is going to be some basic mechanism, a little bit of science, just because not many people get educated in this, and some of this is brand new. And it really sets the stage for understanding why sleep is important, how sleep is regulated. So I'll talk about some basic facts about sleep and some of the sleep science that's new, effects of insufficient sleep, which is kind of what the title points to, on families, on school, on neurocognitive function, mood, etc. Common sleep problems and disorders will be the meat of the talk, which I assume is why some of you might be here. And then their signs, symptoms, and some of the treatment tricks and other things that we do. So we define sleep as a reversible behavioral state of perceptual disengagement from and unresponsiveness to the environment. That's kind of how we experience sleep. We kind of put our car in the garage or our brain in bed and we turn off. However, it's also true that sleep is a complex amalgam of behavioral and physiological processes. And that is the exciting part. And that I hopefully will convince you of tonight, that actually we aren't just idling all night long. There's a phenomenal amount going on that's essential for our physical, mental health, general well-being. So when we're healthy, we're in one of three states. We're either in REM, rapid eye movement sleep, non-REM, non-rapid eye movement sleep, or we're awake. And that's it when we're healthy. These are examples of what the brain does. So this is one electrode. So looking at electrical activity on the brain in one location. And I show this not to get into too many of the granular details, but to show you that the brain does more different things at night than it does during the day. So this is wake. Very active, random activity from all over the brain. As we get drowsy, we see this kind of very regular pattern. Stage 1 is that transitional stage of sleep, about 1 or 2% of the night, where if we were holding a ball and drifting into stage 1, we might drop the ball, jump, be alert and aware that we dropped the ball. Stage 2, about 50% of the night. Stage 3 is one of the deepest stages of sleep. You can see these big, slow waves. Most of the brain is almost meditating or saying the same thing throughout the course of the night in this very slow way. And then rapid eye movement sleep actually looks like wake. We used to call it paradoxical sleep because it's actually a waking brain in interestingly, a paralyzed body. So when we're in REM sleep, our body protects us from carrying out our dreams by shutting down all activity at the level of the brainstem. So throughout the course of the night, this is called a hypnogram. So this is time across this axis here. So 2200, this is midnight here, 2468 a.m. So this would be the sleep period. So we go from wake, we cycle down into non-REM stage 3 sleep, cycle up for a brief period of rapid eye movement sleep, back down for non-REM sleep, up for REM. So the general trend over the course of the night is that non-REM stage 3 is dominant during the first half of the night, and then stage REM is dominant in the second half of the night. So most of our dreaming sleep occurs in the second half of the night. I'll tell you a little bit more about this cycling. But this is very important because we transition 5, 6, 7, 8 times over the course of the night in and out of these different stages. Each time we have one of these transitions, we wake up a little bit, which is actually very normal to wake, or at least be aware for brief periods of time throughout the night. but we also forget a lot about those awakenings. Someone with insomnia, however, will remember a lot more of those awakenings. Now, again, I'll get into that in detail. So this is about as complex as I'm going to get, but herein lies some really important information and really the origin of many of the sleep disorders. So sleep is basically, this is called the two-process model of sleep. So we again have time across this axis here, 9 a.m., 9 p.m. This dark bar here, it would be the sleep period. This is daytime when we're awake. So as soon as we wake up in the morning, we start to accumulate a sleep load, an increasing drive towards sleep. And there's actually a chemical in the brain called adenosine that builds up as our cells function. And the most potent blocker of adenosine, anybody want to venture a guess? Something that most of you had in the morning. Caffeine, right. So it's very effective in blocking this very widely distributed neurohormone that exists throughout the whole brain. So we acquire an increasing sleep debt over the course of the day, and it's maximal before we go to sleep at night, and then we fall asleep and we relieve that sleep debt. So we've actually relieved much of the sleep debt by about 3 in the morning. So we have a second system then, the circadian system, circadian, circ meaning around, 80 in the day. And that's, I'm just showing you one function here of the circadian system, and I'll tell you a little bit more about it, but here's just the alerting signal. So this is deep core biology sending an alerting signal throughout our body and brain. So the circadian system gets activated, increasingly activated once we wake up in the morning, and then is maximal again right around bedtime or just before we go to sleep at night. And then it drops off precipitously and is at its absolute nadir. So we basically have no innervation from it right at this point. So a few key points here. So what does a kid look like who's overtired and has a high sleep drive, but also has a very high alerting signal? A mess, right? And you've all been there. Then if you have a kid who has some regulation problems, attention regulation problems, or some mood regulation problems because they're just primary, or they've been exposed to trauma, or they're difficult situations, or if they live in an environment that's dangerous. We see plenty of kids at Children's who hear gunshots outside of their windows at night. This alerting signal is going to be particularly activated, right? So you can get this intense activation at a time when we're tired, which means that our frontal lobes aren't as active as they should be and aren't editing, aren't blocking, aren't suppressing thoughts. You can get a lot of behavioral dysregulation here. So this very clear example of why people have difficulty falling asleep at night and get activated. There's also because of this, this activation here, and right at this point, there's what we call the forbidden zone or the danger zone, the burst zone, when kids become super activated, right? And you've probably seen your kid bouncing off the walls, jumping on their bed, not doing what they're supposed to be doing right at this point. And that's actually this natural circadian burst that occurs. They may not have insomnia, but you can also observe it in yourself, that maybe it's time to do a few more chores. Maybe it's time to check your email one more time. This kind of drive to do something, or get a little bit anxious about the next day. So that's a very normal activity, a very normal drive that can occur before we go to sleep at night. And what's important about that is that when that does occur, it's a pretty good indicator that you're about 15 to 20 minutes away from a great time to get into bed and begin to calm and fall asleep at night. So it's a good marker of the circadian system and when sleep is at its highest drive point and optimal. So the circadian system's nadir here and the low sleep drive here occur at the same time, which is really great. So this is good. This is not so great design by nature. This is great design by nature, right? So that this helps us get back to sleep, having no alerting signal in the middle of the night when our other sleep drive is actually at its lowest. However, you can imagine that for adolescents who have a biological drive to go to bed later and wake up later, right? So this whole bottom curve here is shifted to your right. That means that the coordination of the sleep load and their circadian nadir aren't lined up. So for some individuals, when there is this a misalignment of these two sleep drives, it can be much easier to be awake for extended periods of time at night. All right, so those are some of the key points, and I'll refer back to the slide a few times just because there's so much in it and it explains so much about the sleep-wake cycle. Any questions? Okay. So this just, again, shows that we have this first sleep period and second sleep period. It used to be called first and second sleep because these qualities of sleep are very, very different across the course of the night. So last year, 3 circadian researchers won the Nobel Prize in Physiology and Medicine. This was a phenomenal event for those of us who are in the sleep field and sleep geeks. What they found was that there are clock genes in every cell of the body. So we used to think that there was one pacemaker in the brain that regulated our 24-hour sleep-wake cycles, but in fact, these clock genes are throughout the whole body and brain, functioning in every cell, coordinated within organ systems, across organ systems. So this adds a massive amount of complexity to consideration of sleep, and in particular, not how much we sleep only, but sleep timing. And this cartoon here just shows what happens at different points during the course of day and night. Best coordination, fastest reaction times, all mediated by the circadian system to some extent. So if your kid is being tested, right, or you're being required to do something that's very, very important, and it does not align with your circadian system, there's some chance that there might be some decrement in function as a result of the time of day that something is happening. Highest core body temperature, high blood pressure, etc., around the clock. So we now understand a lot about this deep regulation of clock throughout our whole body and brain. And this just shows, this I stole from the New York Times, just because I thought it was a beautiful image. Shows the importance of light and this kind of circularity that we live in throughout the course of our lives. And then this just shows sunlight, which impacts this deep clock within the brain. And then this just shows this very, very complicated process of how the different clock genes relate to each other, and how they're not only clock genes, but they're also period genes, which regulate the timing. So when adolescents have this urge to go to bed later and wake up later, they're owls, whereas adults tend to be larks. Owls going to bed later, wake up later, larks going to bed early, waking up early. This is what mediates it. And these, again, are regulating essential function in all of these organs and this big, very special organ up here. So this breaks down, and I've got handouts in the back. If you didn't grab one, you can grab one now or later. This breaks down sleep duration, optimal sleep duration by age group. These are, there are 2 age groupings. I'm not going to go into the details of it, but what I would pay attention to is this narrow age grouping that we provide here. Most of the recommendations that you read about in the press are these, which I think are really much too broad, but we're in the process of publishing this right now. What we also don't get recommendations for in the popular press, or even from my field, is when the optimal sleep time should be for different age groups. And again, you've just learned about clock genes. This is as important as sleep duration. Daytime sleep is also important to consider. CN, anybody want to guess what that stands for? Cat nap. Excellent. So cat naps are actually super healthy, and we differentiate cat naps and dog naps, which are the long afternoon kind of catch-up naps. But cat naps are good. A brief 15, 20-minute nap is very, very rejuvenating and can really improve our function across a range of domains. So napping, there's appetitive napping. Having an appetite is actually normal. There's nothing wrong with that, needing to sleep a little bit in the afternoon. But when it is appetitive, if you're having that daytime sleep because you've not had sufficient sleep the night before, that's never optimal. One of the most common questions is, well, can I ever catch up on my sleep? The answer is no. It's bad news, right? If you're sleep deprived and sleep deprived on a consistent basis, you're actually doing tissue damage. You're impacting your heart, you're impacting your brain. Some of you may have heard that there's a drainage system throughout the whole brain, and that drainage system functions at night to basically clean out all the crud that our brain develops over the course of the day. And if you're not getting adequate sleep, you're not cleaning out all that crud. And there's significantly increased risk, say, of Alzheimer's disease and other problems as well. So recovery naps following acute sleep loss can be okay depending on the situation. Prophylactic nap, hey, I'm going to go do something. We used to call it a disco nap. Take a nap so you can go out and spend all night at the disco. Sleep banking. So word from the military, where they, right up here at Walter Reed, where there's a phenomenal center of sleep research, has shown that sleep banking, and this is, no duh, right? You want money in the bank, you don't want to be in debt. Same with sleep, right? You never catch up on sleep debt. But banking sleep in anticipation of a loss of sleep is much, much healthier. And that's really the way to approach jet lag, an intense period, a mission that you have to go on, etc. But we never encourage 24-hour sleep loss, but certainly sometimes it's necessary. So this is the world that we live in, unfortunately, not the world that we evolved in, right? So we evolved somewhere near the equator, 12 hours of light, 12 hours of dark. We now have light exposure all the time, and we carry our little lights around with us and look at them all the time as well. Light goes directly to the region of the brain that is key in regulating many of our 24-hour sleep-wake cycles or coordinating them across the body and brain. So this is problematic, and what we don't know enough about is whether or not we evolve with this kind of exposure, with this kind of need to sleep at different times. We actually think that what we'll find is that people who are exposed, who live in northern climates with long periods of dark during the day, may be susceptible to different disease, far more susceptible to different diseases because of these circadian regulation issues, which really can be problematic. Any questions, comments? Yeah. So the question is, can a unicellular organism have clock genes? And the evidence is yes, that all living beings on this earth can have clock genes. Even non-nucleated cells have some kind of clock input on them, maybe internally. Trees also have circadian rhythms. So there are some beautiful studies of trees where the vascular system in the tree is differentially activated at night when they droop a little bit, and then during the day when they're more activated. So in essence, everything in our world is regulated by our friend the sun and the absence of the sun in these dark periods. And we can go deep into kind of evolutionary biology and some of the other reasons why this is so critical and so important on another talk. Yes? No. So the question is, can you get stuck in one of the stages of sleep? So generally, no. So if you are very sleep deprived, you might have a little bit more non-REM stage 3, which is we have a high appetitive drive for that. Rapid eye movement sleep is more regulated by the circadian system, the 24-hour system. So our circadian, some people do have a disorder called narcolepsy. It's very rare, but it does exist. We follow a large cohort of them at Children's, kids with narcolepsy, and they lose, for a variety of reasons, one group of cells in the brain that are specialized for one neurotransmitter that is activating and suppresses REM sleep. So they go into REM sleep unexpectedly. But this very reliable cycling between stages is incredibly well preserved, even across many disease states. And animals have a different type of cycling, but also a very regular cycling. And these are regulated. We call that cycling the ultradian system. Now that gets deep into kind of the science of sleep and the biology. So, and these are the challenges for our sleep, right? So you have kind of our historical ancestors who were sleeping in very, very dangerous places, right? So the reason maybe that we have this peak of activation before we go to bed at night is that we want to be in a safe and prepared environment where we can drift off safely. We have this where we're feeding the midnight cookie truck outside University of Pennsylvania, where they're dosing kids with chocolate 24 hours a day. We have kids self-medicating with uppers and downers at the same time at parties and in other settings. We have this in reality, absolute risk of harm, hypervigilance associated with living in dangerous places, having a dangerous job, playing games where threat is constantly present. We have this, all kinds of social interaction, workplace interaction, and obviously our little devices that we carry around, and then constant exposure to light. So these are some of the issues that we need to be aware of as we're considering how our sleep exists now. So this is typical of child and adolescent sleep patterns. This is some data from our lab many years ago. Huge age group, so this is not really say a lot in terms of what's normal for different age groups, but these kids on average were sleeping about 7.5 hours a night or so, and across the course of the week. Shorter, a little bit of catch-up sleep here, a little longer here. Friday night, right, they're out with their friends, they're at a game, they're up super late. Then what do? On Saturday, they catch up for hours. And then Sunday is kind of a little bit back to normal because they have to wake up for school on Monday morning. So we call this big jump on weekends versus weekdays social jet lag, right? And there's also with that a shift in the timing of sleep. So we don't like that at all. Social jet lag has actually been associated with various health risks. So you think about what daylight savings time is like, or you think about what it's like if you are, say, in LA or even Boulder, right, for a week, and then you fly back east, what happens? You're a mess for a few days. It's very, very hard to accommodate to that change, particularly when you're going against the kind of the natural urge of the circadian system to drift forward in time a little bit. So traveling east is always very, very difficult for our system. So in essence, what adolescents frequently do on the weekend, they go to bed late, they sleep in late on weekends, catch up on a lot of sleep. Monday morning, they have to come back to school. So in essence, they're living in Boulder or LA on the weekends, have to come back to DC Monday morning, and they just don't accommodate well. They're constantly in this state of jet lag. So sleep and circadian health effects, they're broad. Just kind of a brief summary of them. Metabolism, regulation, energy expenditure, physical restoration, tissue repair, neuronal recalibration, memory consolidation, learning, multiple functions of insufficient sleep, multiple effects of insufficient sleep across the whole body and brain. Definite effects on neurobehavioral performance, residence after a heavy call night versus alcohol ingestion. So sleep deprivation and alcohol ingestion are comparable in terms of the level of impairment. In our country, adolescents account for 50% of the drowsy driving accidents, right? So that's a hugely concerning figure. And we have no regulations across the country for the most part on how much sleep in adolescents, or no guidance even. When was the last time your pediatrician said to you, hey, you know, how much for your driving child, how much sleep did they get the night before? You hand the car keys to them. So it's really an essential question to ask for us as well, adults as well, but particularly for inexperienced drivers who have a lot of variability in their sleep times. So functions of sleep, just a little bit of data, kind of older data. 10 to 14-year-olds had decrements in verbal and abstract reasoning abilities when sleep deprived. Following sleep deprivation, there's a breakdown. And this is theoretical and concurrent cognitive and affective changes. So it's been hard to kind of nail down specific neurocognitive deficits due to sleep deprivation. But what we think happens is that, you know, what's happening when you're sitting in a classroom or sitting at work, right? You're dealing with a teacher, you're dealing with memory, you're dealing with organization of your notes, you're dealing with the social pressures, You're dealing with all of these things at once. So we think that what falls apart is the coordination of all of these complex activities that all need to happen at once, rather than individual cognitive activities. And we've tried to capture that, although it is complex to measure. And then critically, one of the early studies, Dr. Gozal showed, he just looked at kids who had academic and learning problems, and found that 18% of those kids had problems of sleep disordered breathing, sleep apnea. Right? So sleep problems are exceedingly common in kids with developmental and learning problems and affective problems. It's just a little bit more data. Kids with autism range 55% have insomnia, ADHD, mild sleep disturbance. 19% of kids with ADHD have mild sleep disturbance, 33% moderate or severe. And adolescents with insomnia have a 4 to 5-fold increased risk of depression. And where we get very, very concerned is in some of our studies on school start time change. Right? We've worked with districts in the area and all across the country. I'm sure you've seen it in the news. These early starting schools. What time does the lab start? 8:30, which is actually right where the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends school start time. But for those of you coming from Fairfax, long commute times, it gets to be more problematic. 8:30 is the earliest that schools should start based on the science right now. And we know that risk of suicide is associated with decreased sleep in some of these early starting school districts and across the board, as well as changing school start times or comparison of early and later starting school start times has been associated with differences in automobile accidents. So there are really very, very important effects here. So I've given you some of these that you can copy as many as you want of. This is one of our most potent tools to evaluate sleep. And I just check it out. It's so easy to do. And just do it for a week. And you can look at your sleep variability. You'll learn a lot about your sleep, learn a lot about your child's sleep. And so here is just time across this axis. Midnight, say on, what do I have there? Thursday night, 12:01 a.m. Friday morning, and then noon, etc. So you just shade in the areas where you're asleep. And here you can see this is a pretty good case of what we would call insomnia. Kid going to bed pretty late. Had a whole lot of difficulty falling asleep at night, but multiple awakenings during the night and then multiple early morning awakenings. Sleep habits. When we evaluate sleep problems, this is some of what we're looking at. We look at bedtime. Is there a routine? Is there bedtime resistance? How many of you have kids who are 10 or younger? Okay. And how many of you have kids who are 11 or older? Okay, so a relatively even split. And these different, this gets at all of the sleep problems, but they're very different questions for different age groups. So bedtime, is there a routine? Is there bedtime resistance? Are there bedtime fears? And we differentiate bedtime fears from anxiety. Bedtime fears are absolutely normal. It has to do with that spike in activation that occurs. But kids, particularly young kids, are very compelling with their bedtime fears. And sometimes parents get very engaged in that and tend to reinforce those bedtime fears. EDS stands for excessive daytime somnolence or excessive daytime tiredness. That can be associated in kids with hyperactivity, irritability, and for young kids, difficulty waking in the morning. So if your child is less than 10 and has a lot of difficulty waking up in the morning, pretty good indicator that they're just not getting enough sleep at night. Adolescents don't wake up in the morning well because they are forced to wake up at a time that's biologically inconsistent with their drive. Awakenings, there are call-outs. Is the child fully awake? Are they only partially awake? We call those parasomnias, and I'll define those a little bit later. Restlessness at night, very common, in particular in kids with ADHD, but other kids as well. Regularity, is there a regular schedule? Regular schedule is absolutely essential, right? It really maintains that circadian regularity that we want to see. But we also need to be concerned about age. So is a young child being put to bed at 10 or 11 o'clock at night, which is much too late for them? And does an adolescent try to fall asleep at 7 or 8 o'clock because they have to get up at 4 a.m. for their swimming practice? So, and adolescent typically just cannot fall asleep that early. There is important and interesting variability, though. Some of us are owls, some of us are larks. And I think on that sheet I may give you a reference to a website where you can test whether or not you're more of an evening type or more of a morning type. It just takes a few minutes. And there's variability in our circadian drive. So some of us are strong larks, some of us are strong owls, some of us are super flexible. Others of us really have a strong sleep drive, and that's primarily what drives us. And that's some of the subtlety, well, the art and science of clinical sleep medicine, where we get into where we're trying to tease out these subtle differences in the circadian versus the sleep drive system. And then finally, snoring. Snoring is a pathological condition. We all laugh at it in this culture, right? But it means that you're doing something that's not healthy. Everybody close your eyes for a moment. Okay? And I want everybody to snore twice. Okay? All right, how does that feel? Horrible, right? So imagine if you're doing that all night, your respiratory system, your cardiorespiratory system is responding in the same way to that, right? So it really, just primary snoring can disrupt sleep. Disrupts your spouse's sleep as well, right? So, and there's as much sleep disruption for a spouse who has a snoring spouse. So snoring is really problematic. When there are pauses in snoring, it's a sign of sleep apnea. There can be periodicity, so only when a child is very tired, or if someone's sleeping on their back, or if they have allergies or a cold. All factors that we evaluate in the lab. The first clinical sleep disorder that I want to talk about is restless leg syndrome. And the reason that I'm talking about this first and highlighting it is it's very common in kids with ADHD. And we think that there's a frontal dopaminergic link, perhaps, in kids with ADHD. And this is a disorder where you have uncomfortable sensations in your limbs. Now, kids might not report those. If you go home and say, do your legs feel funny when you're trying to fall asleep at night? You may not report that, because that may be kind of our baseline. If we're that way all the time, we're not going to be able to report that. However, if the question is, when you go to sleep at night, do you lie still? Or do you need to move around a lot to get comfortable? And it's that movement to relieve sensation that's really key that we evaluate. So that's just a clinical diagnosis in the office. And what we do is well, I guess this is on the next slide. Another disorder called periodic limb movement disorder. Effects are not as clear. It's associated with restless leg syndrome, and it's associated with little limb jerks at night. Nothing you would be able to see. We have big limb jerks as we fall asleep at night, as our body's letting go. That's a whole other factor. These are periodic limb movements at night. You can see that they look pretty disruptive. This is this is data from an overnight polysomnographic sleep study. This is we conduct about 1,500 of these at our center a year, where we're looking at breathing and movement during sleep. And there's some association here between the movement and a brief arousal. So for RLS and PLMD, the first line assessment is to look at ferritin, which is a cellular storage form of iron. And when that is below 50, which is in the normal range for most individuals, we recommend, and they're symptomatic, we recommend supplementation. That should actually be 50 nanograms per ml. And then supplementation is pretty easy and pretty well tolerated. And for some kids, not all, who have a lot of behavioral dysregulation, difficulty falling asleep at night, we supplement them with iron. 3 to 4 days later, they look like a different kid, right? That's rare, okay? But those are the success stories. In other cases, we supplement them, it gets a little bit better. But this is important to work up in ADHD kids. So obstructive sleep apnea syndrome is also very important to work up. The primary sign of it is snoring. And if you're hearing snoring, gasping, airflow cessation at night, then it absolutely has to be checked out. We typically say that we evaluate sleep apnea in the sleep lab when there's snoring plus 1. Snoring plus other sleep disturbances, daytime sleepiness, learning problems, ADHD, emotion regulation problems, on and on and on. So snoring really needs to be evaluated. Kids with Down syndrome are kind of the perfect storm for sleep apnea, just because of the shape of their face, head, and neck. So that can be some of the cause, kind of craniofacial differences. This is the most common cause. These are tonsils that sit at the back of the throat, these big fleshy nodules. You can also have large adenoids, large turbinates. So this is a really complex region, right? It breathes, it eats, it talks, and all of that neuronal tissue in there regulating the patency of the upper airway. Lots can go wrong in different regions, and we don't always know what is going wrong or where the problem is. So it's important to work up. This, sadly, is one of the very common causes, but the thought that sleep apnea is only in people who are obese is absolutely not the case. You can have someone who's very, very thin who can have sleep apnea for a whole host of other reasons, but certainly obesity is a major risk factor for obstructive sleep apnea syndrome. Causes: an obstructed or narrow airway due to anything that can go wrong up here. Airway relaxes a little bit at night, gets narrower, and if there's any tissue in that airway, pulling air through a narrow tube, right, pulls it down even further, makes it vibrate, right? And then you can get a collapse, either complete. Go on YouTube and watch someone who has severe sleep apnea. It is frightening to watch, or it can be mild. Just a partial pause called a hypopnea. So typically, you do see snoring. Definitions: partial, complete, or obstruction of the airway. Primary snoring is also occurs in about 12% of children, but it's very hard. I can't tell. I can see two kids, even very, very obese kids who look exactly the same, both snore. One will have severe sleep apnea, one won't. And so we really can't tell. The only way really to differentiate is a sleep study. The effects: so when we snore and we have a pause in breathing, our oxygen levels drop down, CO2 goes up, causes sleep disruption. It wakes our brain up when we have these pauses in breathing. And we see kids with a couple of events per hour who meet criteria for obstructive sleep apnea. We see kids with 150 pauses in breathing per hour, which is really severe sleep apnea. And every time they have one of these events, there's some kind of brain activation. And in the long term, it can cause neurocognitive impairments. In adults who are untreated, adults who have either obesity or diabetes plus snoring, 4-fold increased risk of heart attack and stroke. So it's really bad news. These really need to get treated. What do we do typically with kids? We take out their tonsils and adenoids. It's pretty effective in most cases. I won't go into the details of this, but in some cases we use something called CPAP. So you got the bottom line on that. So behavioral sleep problems. So there are lots of these. So sleep disorders that respond to interventions that are based on behavior and psychological principles, sleep problems associated with lifestyle, mental health issues that require assessment and treatment. So for anxious kids with ADHD, hyper-responsive to the environment, you're going to get a lot more sleep problems. Kids with autism who don't respond to a social channel as well, sleep is a social behavior, they also have a lot more sleep problems. All right, so that's not going to play. I'll just tell you the story here. So this kid, little girl, falls asleep at night, is put into her sink for a bath. Everybody's around, it's bright, the water's warm, and she falls asleep. They put her to bed. Of course, she doesn't fall asleep, right? So they turn off the faucet while the water's running. She twitches a little bit, reaches up, turns the water back on. And then they do it one more time. It goes back to sleep. So this kid has this connection, this cue is essential for her to initiate sleep at night. So those cues are important for all of us, but in younger children and infants, they're particularly important. If you go through what you do before you go to bed at night, chances are you have some pretty good and set rituals that help you transition to sleep. And that in part is due to this letting down of vigilance that's absolutely essential for us to transition to sleep at night. So in young kids, there are two primary kinds of sleep disorders. There's a sleep onset association disorder, where sleep onset or bedtime or wakenings in the middle of the night are associated with a cue, being held, being rocked, parent lying in bed with a child, feeding to sleep at night. Then there's a limit-setting sleep disorder where bedtime is delayed. Parents will tend to engage with kids around fearfulness or any other activity. There's inconsistent limit setting around the activities. We call it curtain call, when a kid comes out of their bedroom multiple times to engage the parent. Parent responds either frustrated or however, and the pattern continues. However, once these kids fall asleep, they typically stay asleep. That's how we differentiate the sleep onset association disorder and the limit-setting sleep disorder. And this can occur at kids 6, 7, and 8, and particularly kids who are anxious, who have difficulty letting down vigilance at night. So what we want to do is we want to identify and eliminate the cues that are present at bedtime that make the child dependent on a parent to fall asleep at night. And we live in a complex society. So for those of you out there or for other parents who work 2 jobs, you have 30, 40 minutes, an hour of quality time with your child at night, and maybe the same in the morning. Saying goodnight and transitioning to sleep at night is by definition difficult. It's very hard to separate. Transition to sleep is really about the first time that parents and children separate. It's this very difficult, very sensitive, very vulnerable period. So there are a lot of reasons why this occurs and should be difficult. We train in sleep hygiene, establish appropriate bedtime routines, and establish appropriate bedtime routines. I guess I've said that twice. So the different approaches to treating this: simple extinction, cry it out, close the door to the room. For the first 2 to 3 nights, the child is very agitated, very unhappy. My favorite anecdote is a kid who parents tried this. They came into the lab and said, by the way, I think we fixed the problem. And they did this. They said the first night, a little boy was in there. I think he was 2.5. And he said, first, help, help, rescue me. So kids, again, it's really compelling what kids engage in. They're not being manipulative. This is what they need to transition to sleep at night. Graduated extinction, incremental withdrawal of parental reinforcement at bedtime, so just taking away those cues gradually, going from sitting on the edge of lying in the bed to sitting on the edge of the bed to moving across the room, to increasing visit intervals, so you can have a parent check out. I'll be right back, sweetie. Step out of the room, stay in bed, I'll be right back. Come back in the room a few moments later or a few minutes later, gradually increase those intervals, and eventually the child will fall asleep on their own and get accustomed to this shift in behavior. So we typically in our lab, people don't typically come to our lab who want to do simple extinction, and that's just not appropriate for all kids and families. So we remain totally agnostic to what parents want to do, even co-sleeping at times. Planned ignoring, positive reinforcement was the excuse me drill that I just talked about, where the parent goes out for a brief period of time and comes back. The timing of reinforcement, so some kids have a bedtime routine that stretches on for 2 hours, right? And it goes on and on and on. It can be more stories, or it just gets very, very complicated. Finally, the bedtime pass is a great technique for any of you struggling with this. You give your child something at bedtime. Say if they're into Lego, it can be a package of Lego. Right? They get to keep that package of Lego if they don't call out to the parent, right? So over the course of 10 days, they can build the set and they can keep it if they keep that packet every night. But if they give it up, right, they start again. So this really puts the onus on them and gives them a lot of independence. So insomnia, about 50% of the population, frequent and persistent difficulty initiating or maintaining sleep, staying asleep at night, that results in general sleep dissatisfaction despite adequate opportunity for sleep. causes daytime impairment in both kids and adults, which looks different across those populations. And we have a very set intervention that we use that's well validated, that involves changing habits, sleep education, that little piece of information that I gave you initially. Awakenings are normal. So rather than waking up and being frustrated, people with insomnia can tell themselves, hey, this is a normal awakening, it's okay. And that can be very helpful. Optimal bedtimes and sleep duration can be implemented. Stimulus control, this is a big one. Not looking at the clock in the middle of the night or checking your phone. That's huge, very, very important. It's a major cue for activation. Changing cognitive labels. Parents will often come into our lab and say, my child is the worst sleeper, right? Well, if that's the mythology that the child has in the family, their sleep is not going to get better. So changing that can be helpful. And we also use relaxation therapy. So that's just a very quick tour of what we do. Some of the sleep hygiene recommendations: establish sleep as a priority, regular bed and wake times, close and intimate time, and quiet time together, regulate caffeine habits, regulate napping, dog naps out, cat naps in, no electronic media use within half an hour of bedtime, quiet and close time, establish an early worry time in the evening can be tremendously valuable. Sit down with your child, do a quick inventory of the day, or have them diary for a little bit to write down what's on their mind so that it's literally and figuratively put away earlier in the night. So, circadian rhythm disorders. So these are common problems that adolescents have, which is a shift of the sleep phase to a later period that conflicts with academic work schedules. Pretty common in adolescents due to this natural biological change. All adolescents have a propensity to go to bed later and wake up later, but not all have this disorder. And I'll show you some pictures of the disorder. This just shows that evening chronotype, bad news about evening chronotype is that it's associated with more health problems. So, and we don't know why that is. Maybe there are some biological reasons why, but it may also be that people with a strong propensity to go to bed later and wake up later have been fighting cultural requirements, environmental requirements, and norms all of their lives and are impaired by that. So this particular kid, 16-year-old boy, presenting complaint, had missed 30 days of school. They came to us because a truancy hearing had been scheduled, doesn't get up for school, can't fall asleep at night. Medical history, pretty much unremarkable. Psychiatric history, some academic problems. So maybe getting up and going to school was a little bit punishing. Looking forward to going to school was a little tough, and a little bit of a history of depression. So this is this kid's sleep log. So here you can see that at 10 p.m., he's trying to get into bed and fall asleep. He gets back up because he can't fall asleep. And you go around to the next, so this is Sunday night, Monday morning, still isn't falling asleep until 2 a.m., finally has to wake up for school at 6 a.m., but slept through first period, because I guess he got into school but slept in school. Again, tries to go to bed, can't, falls asleep a little bit earlier, missed the bus this morning, takes a long nap. Guess what impact that has, right? Drives down a sleep drive, so he's not going to be able to fall asleep at night. So you can see that this child is really, really struggling to regulate his 24-hour sleep period. And then on weekends, he's not living in LA, he's living in Honolulu, right? He's severely shifted, which is severely problematic. So what do we do? First of all, we assess motivation. Why is this happening? Learning disabilities can lead to a desire not to get up and go to school in the morning. Social, relational issues, social avoidance, bullying, all of these things can erode the drive to get up and get to school in the morning. So what we typically do is contract maybe for 2 weeks, just putting away the electronics, and most kids can commit to really trying this for 2 weeks. And when they followed our instructions, the reward, the benefits that they feel are just phenomenal. They're back in control of their 24-hour sleep-wake system. They feel much better. They function much better. So we gradual wake time advance. So on weekends, if they're sleeping in late, we gradually move their wake time earlier. We suggest melatonin 4 to 5 hours before bedtime for a variety of reasons. I can get into that later. Yeah, question?
The dose of melatonin.
Question is, what's a dose of melatonin? Good question. We typically, most of what you get over the counter is 1 to 5 milligrams. That should be sufficient. When we give a dose of pharmaceutical grade melatonin, which you can get online, it can be 0.5, it can be half a milligram. It's really hard to say what you get in these supplements. Some of these companies slip in a little Benadryl to make it look much more effective than it really is. So it's an unregulated industry. So you can go online, do your research, or look for pharmaceutical grade melatonin online, and that's probably the best bet. So half a milligram, 1 milligram might be sufficient. Not really much in the way of overdose potential. We don't think of melatonin as being really problematic at all. There's all kinds of stuff in the literature. Well, it drives down the natural circadian release. There's no evidence of that. Probably the most potent effect that it may have is that it increases estrogen availability just a little bit. In one study of rats where there are super physiological doses for these little rodents, caused some changes in gonadal development. Some people have some side effects, some headache, a little bit of mood disturbance, but that's typically not normal. Yeah, so the question is, whether or not that long-term use of melatonin taken orally is going to have some impact on the melatonin system in the brain. No evidence of that. Has it been studied adequately? Probably not. But I tend to be a little bit looser in the use of this supplement than some of my colleagues. In adults at very high doses who are at risk of stroke, it is a mild vasoconstrictor, so with some older adults who take higher doses to try to sleep, can be problematic, but that's typically never a problem with kids. Another question. Good question. So melatonin is called why is melatonin release, why do you recommend supplementation 4 to 5 hours before bedtime than right at bedtime? So melatonin is called the hormone of darkness, and our bodies and brains begin to release melatonin on the dark cycle. So melatonin release might occur an hour to 2 hours before we go to sleep at night. So if you give it an hour before you go to sleep at night, internal release has already occurred and the effect is less. So theoretically what we're doing is we're giving it before there's any availability in the body or brain to advance that circadian curve. Does that kind of make sense? Yeah, so we're giving it when there's no internal physiological melatonin release to advance the onset of melatonin in the circadian system, which is a signal for us to go to sleep at night. Yeah, so the question is, if giving it to your daughter, she took it half an hour before and you did see some effect, why does that work? So melatonin has two effects. One is that it has mild soporific, mild sedating quality. It makes you just a little bit sleepy. But the most potent effect, we also call it a chronotherapeutic. So it's a time-giving drug, and that's when it's most effective. But it really depends on what the sleep problem is. So if you have an older child, an adolescent who has a phase delay, giving it 4 to 5 hours before bedtime is the primary recommendation. Sometimes we'll recommend double dosing to kind of, to mimic that curve. Unfortunately, the science on it is just not out there. We don't know. So if it is effective, some kids swear by it, right? They take their little gummy vitamin at night and they fall asleep at night. They don't take the gummy vitamin and we don't fall asleep. So we recommend that parents try a little bit of intervention with a little bit of vitamin P, placebo, try that other gummy to see what really happens. So we never like to recommend supplements or any other medication, but this one seems pretty safe and in some cases effective. So we also use light, and what we want to do with light is we want to have high light exposure with adolescents early in the morning and minimal light exposure at night. A colleague did studies with college students in Colorado, took them camping for a week, and kind of watched how they regulated when there was no light exposure or just natural light exposure. Guess what? Everybody lined up beautifully when they were camping. So we're actually out of time for the main portion of the talk. Did you want me to take a break? I've got a few more slides. I can wrap those up. So non-REM parasomnias, these are disorders of arousal, sudden arousals from deep sleep. Category includes sleepwalking, sleep talking, sleep terrors. And these are, relatively normal in kids. They can persist in adults as well. Prevalence tends to decrease with age. Treatment, the first concern is safety. So if you've got a kid who gets up and leaves the house, we've had kids go through windows on rare occasions. We've had a couple of severe injuries, just a couple, very rare, but it does occur. We see adults who are sleep eaters, who get up and eat a lot at night, and that can be severely problematic because they can gain massive amounts of weight. People do all kinds of things at night. Cook at night, eat non-food items at night. Again, very rare, but first concern is safety. Safety, safety. And that puts a burden on parents at times. Parent education, what they are. They're partial arousals from slow wave sleep, when our brain is kind of saying om all at the beginning of the night. And that very deep sleep where you can pick up your young child from the car seat, carry them to their bed, they don't budge, right? So it's from that stage of sleep that they partially wake up. If they don't remember it in the morning, chances are it's a parasomnia. So what do we do? Typically, some schedule modification, we increase their total sleep time. And that tends to improve them for a whole variety of reasons. Sometimes an afternoon nap works. If they occur like clockwork most nights, you can just wake your child just a little bit. Not enough to like fully wake them up, but just rub their back a little bit so that you help them transition to a lighter stage of sleep, which is what the brain may be doing when it has these partial awakenings. So insufficient sleep syndrome, that's most of this culture, unfortunately, at this point. This was a 17-year-old male, history of decreased sleep, inconsistent grades, high pressure at home and school, mild anxiety, and he'd been treatment resistant. He just didn't follow our instructions. So this was his sleep log. On average, he was sleeping a total of 6.5 hours a night, and then he would sleep in on weekends. And then he'd nap just a little bit during the day. So the parent wrote, there's too much going on in this kid's life. College applications, community service, all of these things going on. So they couldn't really prioritize sleep. So after 4 nights, so if you look down here, so after 4 nights, Monday through Friday, of 6.5 hours of sleep, and then on Friday, 17 hours of continuous wakefulness, this says car accident. So he rolled his SUV. Not because he fell asleep at the wheel, but because there was that momentary lapse as he was going around a curve and didn't respond quite quickly enough or didn't take his foot off the accelerator. So this is a very, very common event. So sleep medications, and these are just a few of them, are still used very commonly by pediatricians. None of them are approved for use in kids, except for Benadryl. But a wide variety of these are used in different age groups, which we think is a bit problematic. In part because physicians get an average of 1 hour of sleep education throughout all of medical school. They don't know what they're looking for. It's not their fault. It just hasn't been prioritized. Indications for sedative hypnotics, there are a bunch here. I'm not going to go into the details on that. We already talked about melatonin. So talk a little bit more about, about kids with ADHD, why they have difficulty sleeping, why they get kind of revved up at night, or how they just have difficulty regulating just because there's impairment in executive function and they have difficulty calming down, right? So, so we do see a lot of kids with ADHD in our clinic, and there are a variety of challenges. So one of the first things that we think about is medication, and is the kid being medicated in a way that is really maximizing their daytime function and not interfering with sleep. And there's sometimes kids are helped by a low dose of a stimulant at night, which actually help them calm down and help some of that executive function or help them regulate their affective, their emotional variability at night. For other kids, they can be on a variety of other medications as well to regulate them that can disrupt sleep. Some kids are on clonidine. That's a very common medication, which is an antihypertensive that's very sedating that can help with sleep onset. The problem with clonidine is it's short-acting, and kids with ADHD can then wake up after 4 to 5 hours. And then they can also have an increased risk of parasomnias when they when they use clonidine. But the activation at night is definitely problematic. That there may be excess movement, that they may be that period of hypervigilance gets them more activated. So what do we do with that? Is this getting at your question? So, yep. With some kids with ADHD, there certainly is overlap with inattention, impulsivity, and emotion regulation issues. So one of the places that we focus and really evaluate is the overlap with anxiety and ADHD is high. So is this kid really experiencing a lot of anxiety at night? Can we give them some skills at night at the transition to sleep that help them calm their body and brain and help them focus? And often that's mindfulness-based relaxation skills, and we work, we have a protocol that we use to really fit mindfulness-based relaxation, even for a hyperactive or even for a 2 to 3-year-old, how to teach them how to bring everything down. And we use kind of multi-sensory focus to find the adequate channel to really help them settle. So giving them techniques to settle and quiet down. Giving them relying on what they do during the day to really settle down and focus can also be helpful. If they awaken at night, giving them strategies to deal with falling back to sleep at night, which fall into some of the categories of an insomnia, where we teach them how to transition back to sleep, either by getting out of bed and doing something quiet out of the bed, learning that wakings during the night are normal. We'll also use some sleep restriction, and that can cut both ways. Sometimes we want to extend sleep in kids with ADHD. And there is some evidence with some kids with ADHD that they're actually overtired during the day. So if you extend their sleep time and or sometimes even give them a brief nap, they can regulate better and fall asleep more easily at night. So there are a whole host of issues that we address with kids with ADHD. Unfortunately, often if the kid, depending on the type of ADHD and how driven they are, it's often a medication that will help them fall asleep at night. We almost never use sedative hypnotics, benzodiazepines in kids, but usually we get some success. Sometimes sleep restriction can also be helpful for them, but that can cut both ways and can get them more activated during the day. So it's tricky. It really depends on the kid. We use sleep logs. We interview them, we look at their sleep habits, we figure out what the triggers are for them and what helps them settle at different points during the day at night, and we really rely on those resources. Yeah. So the question is having motor tics, why, first of all, why they disappear, why they can disappear at night, and then on why they might be worse as the child's falling asleep at night, and then why they might occur during the night for some kids. So again, it's multifactorial as far as I know. We do see the disappearance and in some cases emergence of odd behavior during the night. And so some of that's related to kind of shifts in neurotransmitter systems. Some of it can also be psychophysiologic, so it's really state-based. So it's both kind of the holding yourself awake, trying to focus, postural activation, may lead to some kind of overflow in the brain and body. Maybe it's neurotransmitter based. I think it's probably multifactorial. The twitches that we have at night for your child, I can kind of think hypothetically why it might get worse at bedtime. Maybe that there's less control. Maybe there's a little bit of anxiety about going to sleep. Maybe just letting go and letting down is a difficult thing to do, which is hard for all of us. The experience of motor tics throughout the night that would keep you awake, we'd probably, need to do a sleep study to look at the body and brain and look at what's happening. Could be medicated. That could be one intervention. You'd also want to differentiate. Some of us have what are called hypnic jerks. So as we're falling asleep at night and on our wake system, it transitions to our sleep system. We have discharges where we jerk and have these sleep starts. And those can be differentiated from tics as well. So that's something else. So the question is, do you outgrow restless leg syndrome and periodic limb movement disorder? So it depends on the cause. So if your child didn't respond to iron, then there probably is some link. We think that there's a link with dopamine. So that activating neurohormone that's involved in kind of addictive behavior or high reward behavior, and that also is involved in regulation of movement. So it could be dopaminergic, that if your child also has been diagnosed with ADHD, which is defined as a hypodopaminergic disorder, it could be dopamine linked theoretically. And the old treatment for restless leg syndrome was dopamine agonists. Those typically are not used in kids, but low dose, going to a neurologist with a low dose of that could be helpful. There are other medications that help keep the brain asleep, more asleep at night, that are very safe. Gabapentin is a kind of it works on nerve tissue, and it's an anti-seizure med. It's a little long-acting, so it can cause some problems. But it depends. It could be genetic. It could be constitutional for a whole host of different reasons. And you could do a more careful study of putting them on iron and then taking them off it, and using actigraphy, which is an ambulatory monitor, or polysomnography if you try to want to tease it out. There's really no good test. Sleep study doesn't tell you all that much about restless leg syndrome. It tells you about periodic limb movement disorder, which may or may not be disruptive of sleep, and can be variable across different nights. So what I would probably focus on is if he really has difficulty settling at night, and is very, very active and has to move. Maybe another course of iron, or maybe some other medication, either a dopamine agonist or something else that will suppress his response to the probably neurological sensation that he has in his legs. And so if it's an underlying activation of sensation in the legs and movement releases it, some kids have this 24 hours a day, and that's the overlap between RLS and ADHD, that what you're really seeing is internal sensory activation. So there might also be some other approaches, say heavy brushing, or a heavy blanket, or a lot of exercise before you go to bed at night. So some of those things could potentially work, but none of them are kind of validated or kind of absolute interventions. Yeah. So the question is, with a kid with ADHD who has multiple problems, some snoring, some migraines, what do you do in terms of evaluation? ENT said snoring is really not a problem. A neuropsych said ADHD. So, my bias is obvious, right? That I'm going to say snoring +1, right? That's the standard. And that's actually, in the American Academy of Pediatrics, that's what's recommended, snoring +1. So if there's snoring plus a behavior problem during the day, or an attention problem during the day, I say do the sleep study. There's not much else that you're going to find. I mean, unless, the rarest of rare cases, you find a mild abnormality, you find a seizure disorder. Those are so vanishingly rare, though, that if she does have mild sleep apnea, that can cause may cause a lot of the behavioral dysregulation during the day, may cause a little bit of it, but you're at least correcting a problem. And again, snoring in itself is problematic. It activates, the whole host of systems in the upper airway, activates the brain, increases heart rate, increases respiratory rate, et cetera, throughout the night, which is really not good. And someone who has mild sleep apnea, in one child, it doesn't really have much of an effect. In another child, it has a large behavioral effect. So I would say probably neuropsych testing may cost half as much as a sleep study. Both are covered by insurance. I'm not advocating saying, come to our center, do a sleep study, but I think clinically it's indicated. So a few things are going on. So this is a question about, a kid who's just at kind of the cusp of puberty or going into puberty, who has some ADHD symptoms, and who's very, very compelling arguments or very rigid about doing certain things that he wants to do at night, and treatment resistant, can be anxious, etc. So this is a very common presentation, and what we'll typically do is kind of find his motivation points, okay, and what he's interested in. One thing that we always ask about is, hey, what was your sleep like this summer or on vacation, right? So if he sleeps, from midnight or 1 a.m. till 10 or 11 a.m. On vacations or weekends, and he does much better during the day, and his sleep is much more consolidated, he doesn't have difficulty falling asleep, right? That would be a suggestion that when puberty hits, one of the markers of puberty is the shift in the circadian system, and may be one of the most potent ones. So he may have, because he has ADHD and a little bit of anxiety, he may have had a lifelong history of at least mild insomnia, kind of letting down vigilance, difficulty falling asleep at night. But then when puberty hits, falling asleep at night early so that he can get up for school on time becomes more problematic because his circadian phase has shifted to a later period. So you've got a combination of problems. So what do? Again, what we try to do is kind of try to find a leverage point for that child motivationally. Hey, why don't you try an experiment with your friends for 1 week, right? Where you all agree to drop social media after a certain time during the week. And let's see what the little social network does and how they function differently, right? If everybody drops it. And usually you can convince anybody to try something for 1 week to see if it works, right? There are not going to be any side effects to the shift in the sleep phase. So that would be kind of what we might try. If the kid is dragged into our office, they're disinterested. We've had, these kids who are 15, 16, 17 who are professional gamers, and they're playing games with kids in Australia. There's not a whole lot we can do motivationally, right? If a kid absolutely refuses and they're tied into their social media, you can take more extreme measures and just cut it off at a certain time during the night, just gone. And kids will usually balk at that and feel a little bit left out, or you contact the group of parents and say, hey, I've got this problem, do you guys see this as well? What if we cut things off at night for a period of time? So it's tough. I mean, my profession is to find the motivational points and to be compelling about them, and to help a child identify a problematic behavior and change it. And usually kids will identify, I'm tired in the morning, or I hate going to sleep at night. And if we promise that we can make it better, at least, if not fix it, usually they will commit or jump in and be willing to try something different. And then when they own it and try something different and feel the difference, feel more in control, sometimes they'll continue with the program.
Okay.
Maybe. So the question is whether or not, how problematic phones are. We have phones by our beds that we use as alarm clocks. The other issue with kids is that, where do they do their homework? 99% of homework now is on a device with a switch, right? And so there are a couple of different problems with phones and looking at phones before we go to bed at night. First of all, kind of the activating quality of the content on the phones, that we kind of get addicted and want to keep checking. A little ping can be very rewarding for an adolescent, because that means somebody's interested in them and engaging with them. That's incredibly reinforcing. And putting that down, I mean, our kids are so busy and so overworked that, having social engagement for them, that they thrive on that. That's the most important thing to them. So absolutely taking away a phone at night is not, it's just not always feasible. But if it's causing a problem, then it is highly recommended. So using them as an alarm, if you're not going to look at them, that's no problem at all. But if you are looking at them, the other effect of the phone is light, right? So the light, particularly in a teenager, suppresses the release of melatonin and shifts the whole circadian phase so that it becomes harder to fall asleep at night. That channel of light impacting the circadian regulation is variable across individuals, but if it hits the wrong time, it can really be problematic for teenagers, or really for any of us for that matter. So the question is fatigue parenting, which I love the term, which is really getting a child absolutely exhausted physically during the day, and then they sleep well at night. I think that there's a lot of value in that. But it depends on the kid with ADHD. That some kids, the activation right before bedtime, we typically think that a lot of exercise right before bedtime is more activating.
Yeah.
But within an hour or two of bedtime, it's going to tire the child. It may help. There's evidence that muscle tissue has a powerful circadian effect. So if you really are working muscle tissue, it's going to put out something that relates to something in the clock genes puts something out, enzymes, some kind of signal that may be more potent in helping an individual fall asleep at night. So I think that there's probably physiological evidence that that's a great approach, not necessarily for all kids. It may be more activating for some kids, but absolutely, exercise as an approach to helping somebody sleep at night can be extremely helpful. So I'm saying,
Okay.
right on. Nothing wrong with that. Yeah, so the question is whether or not TV light is as bad as phone light. So any light is bad, and the blue spectrum lights seem to be worse. So, if you have to use your computer at night or if you have to use a phone, use the automatic feature that dims it to more amber light. But yes, television is problematic. We see lots of kids who fall asleep with TV on at night. And typically we want them to get rid of it, shift to music, or shift to even an audiobook where they're at least listening to something. The light is problematic, and the content on TV is problematic as well, typically. Even the home shopping channel, because of the variability in volume, right? When things get exciting, it kind of activates us, gets us interested, keeps us... The whole point of TV is what? To keep us watching.
But if it helps you fall asleep, how does it help?
So TV helping you fall... So how is TV a problem if it helps you fall asleep? So for some individuals, it's habitual, right? That you need that degree of activation to what? Calm your mind. Let down vigilance. Let go. Drop the anxiety. Drop the activation. It's totally common and normal. Can you shift to something else that might be healthier? Absolutely. So implementing some of the mindfulness-based techniques, even when it's poo-pooed and not really accepted as something that can be useful. Watching a kid with ADHD or anxiety experience a mindfulness technique, when we're very creative about how we implement it and how we really hit the channel that they will respond to, it's a beautiful thing. You see everything relax and let go. It can be very hard to find that. But if you don't call it mindfulness or meditation or relaxation therapy, you call it something else, a little thought experiment, regulating your brain activity. It's really useful and effective for all of us. So I think generally TV is problematic. Families who live in chaotic environments, kids who have had severe abuse or trauma, I let it go. If that's their habit, if that's the only thing that they need. Some kids bang their head at night in a very, 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 very dramatic way. And that's what they need to let down their activation at night. Now, we train them to do other things, but sometimes that degree of psychophysiological activation is necessary for people to let down their vigilance at night and relax. The question is, you acknowledge exercise, which is your business, but also light, and how light is effective and how it can be used. So there are devices on the market now pretty cheap. They used to be about $100 to get, the lux in this room is about, maybe 1,000 lux. These lights deliver 10,000 lux, right? And they're built for circadian rhythm disorders and seasonal affective disorder, where people need light exposure to elevate mood. So yes, they're absolutely effective for circadian and sleep regulation. When that you use them can be a little bit tricky. So, and you need to be aware of where you're trying to treat someone. With an adolescent with a very severely shifted sleep schedule, if their optimal fall asleep time is 7 a.m. and you're giving them light at 6 a.m. to get them to wake up, you can potentially flip them around the clock, right? That's pretty rare. So, but typically so if you give light just before, there's a circadian marker called the acrophase. If you give light just before that, it's going to delay the sleep phase. If you give light just after it, it's going to advance the sleep phase. So this is studies in rats and to some extent studies in humans. Human sleep is more multifactorial than it is in rats. So light absolutely has an effect. Light also may be important for mood regulation, okay? But you need to be a little bit careful about when you're exposed to it. But bright light at night, before you go to sleep at night, will definitely have a tendency to delay melatonin release and this cascade of all other factors that impact your sleep-wake regulation. So the question is an eye mask recommended? In some cases, an eye mask can be helpful to go to sleep at night, depending on the environment. I would say that in the hour or two before bedtime, decreasing bright blue light is really optimal. And increasing bright blue light in the morning is also probably optimal. So why don't I stop there? I know you guys have something else to go to. Thank you for the good, challenging questions.